When dedicating your life to jewelry, you sometimes catch yourself saying, I know it isn't going to cure coronavirus, but we shouldn't forget, though, that jewelry can be considered man's first step towards artistic expression. Primitive man adorning him or herself, and some said it perhaps is the oldest art form on the planet. We can take pride in continuing a tradition that has roots dating back so long. Jewelry enables the communication of identity. It allows the transportation of memory and it inspires. To talk about his passion for the field and his body of work, I have invited Dr. Jack Ogden, a man who traces these stories of jewelry and gems through the ages, researching, teaching, and writing about them. He is considered one of the foremost experts in his field and is the current president of the Society of Jewelry Historians. With much excitement, I would like to say welcome, Dr. Jack Ogden.
Thank you very much indeed. That's a lovely introduction. I'm happy to have the chance to talk about my passion.
So, Dr. Ogden, to start, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is you do?
Well, I was born into a jewellery family. My great-grandfather started a jewellery business in Yorkshire in the north of England back in the 1890s. And setting up what became a very successful jewellery company, he was also a passionate amateur archaeologist. He travelled all over the Middle East. He knew some of the great excavators, Howard Carter, Sir Leonard Woolley and people, and actually helped out with some of the excavations, not digging holes in the ground, but of looking at jewellery that was found afterwards and advising on it. So one likes to think that some sort of jewellery gene came down through the generations. But I think the more practical thing is that when I was very young, just 7 years old, we moved up to Yorkshire, in fact, and my father did a lifelong ambition. He bought an old farmhouse, about 300 or 400-year-old farmhouse that needed renovation. And so we kept digging up things like old sheep skulls and horseshoes and stuff. So I very soon started my own little museum. So this is about the age of 7, coming up for 8. This was sort of recognized by the family that I was this sort of budding amateur archaeologist. And they said, oh, your great-grandfather was interested in this stuff. And then a few years later, someone said, I'm sure there's some old books of his somewhere. And they dug out a few old books that had survived in an attic somewhere, and even a little box of bits, including a little Roman earring, gold earring. And one of the books was about early jewelry technology, the only thing that had ever been written, 1924 book at that period. And I could actually, with a magnifying glass, which of course every jewelry family has, lots of them lying around, I was actually able to look at this thing from a very early age. So one could say that I've been looking at jewelry, ancient jewelry, under magnification since my very early teens. So it's a long history. And then I got more interested. I dragged myself to hitchhike actually to the Paris Tutankhamun exhibition in 1967, the first of the great European blockbuster exhibitions, and got totally enthralled by Egyptian jewelry. And it really just developed from that. So I joined the family jewelry business, never that excited by it. Retail, you buy a diamond ring, you sell it, and you order another diamond ring. But I went for a year, sort of training, it was called, to work for a wonderful gentleman called Dr. Edward Gubelin, who owned a famous jewelry shop in Switzerland. And I was there for just under a year. And he recognized my interest, and he was famous for his work on looking at the internal bits of gemstones, inclusions. So I had lots of microscopes. And he'd actually had a small collection of pre-Columbian gold. And he let me look at this under a microscope. And this was my first ride on a microscope. So before I was hitting 20, I'd been looking at old jewelry under a microscope and got totally hooked. And basically that's my start, and that's how I got into it. And ever since then, I've been building up this stuff, studying, researching. And over the years, I must have looked at many tens, maybe into the hundreds of thousands of pieces of historic gold, ancient, medieval, and so on, gold work under a microscope. And the interesting thing is nearly every piece I've looked at, I've learned something new. There's always some little quirk, some little difference. You think, why? How? And you learn. It's a constant learning thing. It's not just repeating the same thing over and over again. It's a constant voyage of discovery. Well, for me anyway, it's a fascinating subject to have got into.
As a true gem and jewelry lover and to support your research, you have had the opportunity to handle really some of the world's most famous gems and pieces of jewelry. Could you maybe tell us a really memorable experience you've had with a piece of jewelry or a gemstone?
Oh, it's difficult to know where to start. I mean, some of the most memorable experience are when you find something is a fake and you have to tell the owners. There's been a few occasions of that, which can be embarrassing. Um, Memorable experience, if you want, I was in the basement of the museum in Amman in Jordan. I did some work on a excavation. Well, I didn't work on the excavation, but I was working on the publication of a small hoard of gold jewelry from the early Iron Age. And I was down in the basement of the Amman Museum with my portable microscope, and the only lighting was the decent lighting was a photographic, one of these very high wattage photographic bulbs. So I had that sort of clipped very near to the microscope, and I actually set my hair on fire from this while I was looking down the microscope. So in memorable terms, that's probably the most memorable. In terms of memorable jewelry, spending a few days in the basement of the Hermitage in St. Petersburg, looking at some of the Greek and Scythian jewelry, gold work that had been found on around the Black Sea. So that was quite an experience. But I looked at many museums around the world. I looked at jewelry. And so, I mean, I've learned something probably from every piece I looked at, and wonderful range of pieces, yes. Quite often it's not the most spectacular that actually teaches the most. Sometimes the minutest fragment can give us an insight into something new.
Having sort of looked at jewelry across the whole world and across ages and time with lots of different styles, do you have a preference, or are you just naturally curious for all of them?
I'm very, I think the word's fickle on this one. If I'm sort of doing some work on a Byzantine piece, that's becomes the center of my interest, and that's all I'm wanting to find out more about. And then next week it'll be sort of a bit of Achaemenid Persian gold or a Roman something. So I tend to sort of move. I like pieces with a fairly solid and fairly strong statements, I think is the word. I mean, I'm not desperately keen on sort of ancient Etruscan jewelry. It tends to be a bit frilly and delicate. I like kind of chunkier bits and major statements. But as I say, it changes. I mean, at the moment, my most recent research has actually been about some historic gemstones. So that's moving into a slightly different field. But I don't think there's a major sort of subject that I've always been interested in one particular period of jewelry. It changes. It changes with me. I mature, and so the area I'm interested in changes as well.
And you have specialized in the history of jewelry techniques, and have also advised auction houses on these fakes, as you referenced before. Could you tell us a little bit more about this work and this area and the world of auction houses, how it operates, perhaps?
Yes, I should say a little bit how I got into this, because I mean, in the family jewelry business, they saw I was interested in older stuff. So in the 1970s, with my family's permission, I started buying and selling a few very early pieces alongside the usual sort of range of jewelry stuff, and that built up, and that sort of eventually took over. But then in the sort of late 80s, it was all getting a bit tricky, and for various reasons. And I realized I was more interested in studying than buying and selling. I was never a good dealer in these things. I was much more interested in learning about the pieces than trying to make a profit out of them. So I moved into the purely sort of consultancy world. And in that consultancy, I mean, research doesn't pay. I mean, essentially, I mean, I don't think I've ever been paid for writing a book. I mean, you do it out of love. So to sort of put bread on the table, I do sort of consultancy work, which basically means traveling around, looking at objects for people and telling them whether I think it's right or wrong. It's only an opinion. I'm not infallible, but people do ask me these things. And quite a lot of this work over the years has been for the major auction houses, mainly here in the United States. And really, it's the case they get offered a piece is brought into an auction house, and they want to know that it's genuine. And I mean, they have excellent people working in auction houses, but they're not specialists. They don't have a specialist for ancient jewelry. The guy they have, or the team they have doing ancient art, they might have specialists in marble and terracottas and pottery and all this stuff. So I sort of fill in the gaps on the precious metal side for some of these people. And so I look at these things and study them. I wander around with my portable microscope and a portable X-ray fluorescence analysis equipment and stuff like that, and look and advise them. And I mean, obviously it's only an opinion, but generally speaking, if I say something I don't think it's right, then they probably won't put it in the auction. It's tricky because you have to be very careful with old pieces, with ancient pieces particularly, because there's forever really, but particularly more in recent years, there's been a high lot on objects being looted, stolen, particularly with the turmoil that's been in the Middle East over the last few years. A lot of pieces being looted from sites, a lot of illegal excavation. So the auction houses have to be meticulous about checking where these things have come from, and are they really an old collection that's been in Detroit for 100 years, or was it sort of smuggled out of Syria 3 months earlier? So they do their due diligence. And it's quite difficult for me to sort of add to the provenance, but occasionally I get to look at the paperwork, and it's interesting how often you now get fake paperwork, which can be as sophisticated as the fake objects, wonderful old letters of ownership and fake receipts and so on, trying to create a kind of chain of custody that never existed. So, the auction houses, by and large, are extremely careful. I mean, I can't say that for all of them, but the major ones are extremely careful in what they sell, both in terms of authenticity and that it has a good origin. It's not something that shouldn't be on the market.
Evidenced by the many books you have written out of passion, you are this prolific writer and educator, keen to really share what you have researched. Which books are you perhaps most proud of? And are you working on anything new at the moment?
It's a difficult question, that. I mean, my original book, 1982 book, Jewellery of the Ancient World, which sort of covered the materials and technology of ancient jewellery. It didn't stray much past the Roman period. It's sort of ancient and Roman. I was proud of that. I mean, that was sort of broke a lot of ground in the subject. I think it was the sort of first book that covered the subject in any detail. So I was very proud of that. And it was quite useful because I might have hinted earlier, I actually left school at the age of 16 without much qualification, I must admit. I had a few what used to be called O-levels. And when I wrote my book, a very useful source was an old book, actually, that had been re-edited, called Ancient Egyptian Materials and Industries, originally written by a guy called Lucas way back, almost a century ago, but it had been updated in the 60s by John Harris, who was a professor of Egyptology at Durham University. And because he had been a very useful reference, I actually sent him a copy of my book. And next time he came to London, he said, "Oh, can I come and have a chat?" So he came in and had a chat. And he said to me, "Oh, it's a very interesting book. I liked it a lot. Where did you do your degree?" And I said, "Well, actually, I skipped that stage. I haven't done one." He said, "Well, had you ever thought of doing a doctorate?" And I thought, well, hang on, no. I mean, I have, half a dozen O-levels. That's not going to get me very far. He said, yes, but most universities have this policy of accepting for PhDs, for doctorates, people who have a degree of suitable level or equivalent proof of academic, whatever it is. And he said, your book certainly is of a standard to qualify you to do a doctorate. Would you like to do a doctorate under me at Durham University? So I was actually thrilled by this, of course. So I sort of signed up for this distance doctorate. I mean, basically, it was just a case of doing my research and visiting Durham every now and again and chatting with him. So it was he. I mean, so in a sense, my book was not only a kind of a landmark in doing something; it was also an entry to sort of furthering my qualifications. And I mean, it might sound very silly, but being able to say you're a doctor and having initials after your name does cut quite a lot of ice, particularly when you're sort of doing work for other people at a later stage in your life. So it sounds a bit snobbish, that, but it had an impact and it was quite useful.
And are you working on anything new at the moment?
Yes, well, I said most of my recent work has been on gemstone, a book called Diamonds, An Early History of the King of Gems, which studies the use of diamonds from, well, the first diamonds in jewellery and so on, few centuries BC through to the beginning of the 18th century. So I looked at that, but I've also been doing quite a lot of articles on gemstones. In fact, the most recent one that's come out in the Journal of Gemmology is on the so-called Black Prince's ruby, which is a stone most people have heard about in the imperial state crown, in the British crown jewels. This huge, great red, it's not a ruby, it's a spinel, it's a huge, great stone that, it's called the Black Prince's because it's supposed to have come down from the Black Prince. So anyway, I traced this thing back as far as possible through sort of medieval documentations or Arabic and Spanish, French, English documentation. And the whole thing basically is I won't use a rude word, but let's say there's nothing to substantiate the history whatsoever. The connection with the Black Prince was only suggested as a possibility in the 18th century on very, very flimsy evidence. And in fact, it's not impossible, but there's absolutely no evidence that it was the Black Princes at all. So that's quite fun. So I've been working on stuff like that. But in the background, I'm doing a book on ancient and medieval goldsmithing technology, which is taking a long time. It's growing by the minute. I mean, it gets bigger and bigger. And this has allowed me to use another of my passions, and that is 3D graphics, because most of the things are now illustrated using 3D graphic program, very much the same as a lot of jewelry designers are using, because it's a very good way of illustrating construction and assembly, because photographs don't often show it. It's not easy to see what you mean, and you can't explode an ancient piece of jewelry. And line drawings are quite difficult these days to sort of people to grasp them, sort of things. And so it's all three-dimensional 3D graphics works beautifully. So this next book will be largely illustrated with 3D graphics on how they made jewellery in ancient and medieval times. Don't ask me when it'll be finished. The answer was it was going to be finished the Christmas before last, but you know what it's like with books. I hope in the next year or two.
And when you talk about the graphics that you started to introduce in the books, are you drawing them yourself?
Yes, I've really got into this. This started by accident, really, because it was about 2000, 2001, I was approached by a Greek company who they'd got a European grant, or proposing a European grant, to see if it was possible to reproduce. There's a type of Byzantine Greek gold pierced work. It looks like lace done in gold. But what it tends to be is sort of fairly repetitive motifs just arranged in different ways. And you get inscriptions done in this pierced work. And they were trying to work out whether it's possible to set up a computer program to reproduce this. So you could say what your name was, and then the sort of computer would then come out with a pretend Byzantine pendant with your name written in this pierced work. So for the sort of technical background to this, they approached me because I'd written about this Byzantine pierced work. And I said, yes, it's a fascinating project. I'd love to do it. And it's being done with sort of EU funding. And the only way of doing this is computer graphics. And they that were using computer graphics for other things, that's what they did. Very early adopters of this stuff. They said, well, there's a program called Rhino. You should try. So I got this thing and took to it, loved it. And there's a funny backstory to that one, actually, because, I mean, in England, you go through different stages of schooling. And when I left sort of what we would call a junior school and went off to the senior school, and my exams to get into the senior school, let's say, were all right in the sort of maths and sciences, but my Latin, which was kind of fairly important back in those days, was terrible. Certainly hadn't passed in Latin. So I was being interviewed by the headmaster at the school I was going to, actually the housemaster at the school I was going to. And he said, what do you want to do in life? And I said, well, I want to be an archaeologist. And he said, to do archaeology at university, you have to have Latin. I'm not sure this is right. He said, your sciences and maths are very good. I'm not sure what, and he suddenly thought, Latin might become less important in archaeology and archaeology is becoming a far more scientific subject. So why, if I said you can come to the school, we'll accept you, but you don't do Latin, you do mechanical and engineering drawing instead, which is an option. So I said, well, sure, if it gets me into the school, I'll do that. So I started doing mechanical and engineering drawing, which sounds a weird subject, but the sort of the way to envisage something in 3 dimensions and to see it from different angles and exploded views. I mean, then basically Rhino just does the same thing, but rather than a big wooden drawing board and pencils, you're doing it on screen. So at the school, unconsciously, unknowingly to me at the time, actually prepared me to use Rhino, many, many years later. The interesting thing about using Rhino to sort of demonstrate or show how old pieces of jewelry were made, it actually gives me new insights. So you suddenly realize that curve is actually a sort of a curve in 2 or 3 dimensions, and there's no way that would join up unless they'd done this. So it's far more than just sitting and drawing a piece. Trying to actually model it in 3D gives you insights into its construction. I don't think you can get in any other way.
Your involvement in the wider industry has also been multifaceted. You've been CEO of the National Association of Goldsmiths, I believe it was called at the time, and launched the Jeweller magazine. You worked for GEMA and launched the Society of Jewellery Historians in 1977, to name only but a few. What do you feel is the role of these various institutions in the field, and how have these developed through time, and what do you think are the challenges or gaps in knowledge they really have to currently still address?
God, that's a huge question. One can answer that for a long time. Yes, I mean, most of the things are sort of fairly by chance in life. In the mid-1990s, I'd sort of exposed, let's say, a forgery sort of racket going on in Italy. And I got this sort of slightly scary phone call that basically was asking about the health of my children and don't let them play in the streets sort of conversation. So I thought, I've got to be a little careful on this stuff. And there's certain people involved in the forgery industry that might not want me, to do this work. So I thought, maybe I should try something different. And I think almost the same day I was rung up by a friend in London who said, there's this National Association of Goldsmiths that they're looking for a CEO. So I thought, well, that would be fun thing to try. So I went along for the interview and the job there didn't actually interest me that much, but it was a split job in those days. Essentially, it was 3 days a week running the National Association of Goldsmiths, as it used to be. That's a long time before it sort of amalgamated with the British Jewellers Association. So 3 days a week running that, and the other 2 days a week was running what CIBJO, the International Jewellery Confederation. And that was far more interesting because you're sort of working with the jewelry industry right around the world, and there's a lot of travel, which is always fun, or used to be fun. So running that was the sort of the icing on the cake for taking that job. I mean, I think that the National Association of Goldsmiths was a strange animal in many ways then. It was an organization for retail jewelers in the UK. And it took that very strictly, retail jewelers. I mean, you had to have a shop at the front door and a sign above it saying jeweler to be allowed in. And so when companies like Argos started selling jewelry, there was these huge debates whether they should be allowed in or not. And, is it better that they're in helping us or outside? No, it's better to have them inside the tent pissing out than the sort of logic. And, people who are selling jewelry, but from upstairs offices, were they allowed? And then all the problem with valuers, because of people valuing and appraising jewelry. Most of them in those days were working as part of retail shops, but more and more independent ones were growing up. But so the National Association of Goldsmiths wanted to keep some sort of control over sort of quality of valuations being done, but people who didn't actually have shops weren't supposed to be members. So it was an interesting time in the British industry. And basically they had a newsletter. It was a kind of, just a few sheets almost stapled together in the corner that used to go out, called Confidential Info, which is a strange name, but that's what it was in those days. So I thought there was room for a magazine in the industry. It seemed like a fun idea. So we decided to launch this kind of relatively glossy magazine for its day, and great decisions of what to call this thing. And we thought of all these names, and whatever we looked up, there was something already in the world called that. The professional jeweler, there's one of those. There's the something jeweler, the retail jeweler, no, that's gone. Then suddenly, what about just the jeweler? It's so starkly obvious, but no one had actually called the magazine just the jeweler, so we called it the jeweler. And I think it served a purpose because it covered what things you shouldn't put in your ultrasonic or cleaning machine, and what are the problems with nickel in the early days before people were worrying much about it. So I think it sort of brought a lot of topics into the sort of the retail jewelers that they weren't aware of and things, and helped training. It's all about education. It was an interesting time. It was really about sort of bringing together retail jewelers and educating them. The CIBJO side was great because that's trying to lay down international guidelines. They're not laws or rules, but they're guidelines about what you should or shouldn't do, ways you should describe things, what's wrong, what's unfair trade practice. I remember one thing that I managed to push through in my days was the fact that a lot of jewelry was made in yellow gold and then rhodium plated and then sold as white gold. So, somebody would order a ring in white gold. So all the jeweler did was rhodium plate their yellow gold one and sell it to them. And this was because this would wear off, of course, and leave horrible yellow gold showing through. So the idea that this was an unfair trade practice is one of the things that CIBJO did. But they produced guidebooks on gemstone, what to declare and what not to declare. So that was a very important role. It's difficult because there's no policing. CIBJO can say, you have to call a synthetic sapphire, but unless there's someone around, knocking on doors and checking that it's being done, it's slightly empty exercise. But it's good, and it's getting sort of quite a reputation in the world, CIBJO, for laying down these rules, and works closely with things like international standards. So it's doing a good job. Then I actually moved to Germany for a few years. For various reasons at the time. Then when I came back to the UK, just at the time they're looking for a CEO for the Gemmological Association. And that seemed like quite an interesting thing to do because I'd actually trained with the Gemmological Association in the 70s. And that seemed like a fun thing to do, an interesting thing. They had a laboratory, a gem lab, which was an exciting thing to be involved in. So I took that on, which was a lot of fun. Interesting. Unfortunately, the 2007-8 crash happened. Finance has got in a bad state. And the laboratory, which had never been a paying proposition, unfortunately, was just not economic to keep going. It either needed something like £1 million worth of investment to buy equipment, up-to-date equipment, or closing down. And very sadly, we had to take the closing down option, which was probably one of the saddest decisions was involved in my life, I think, really. So, yes, it was an interesting thing on the gemmological side, and that, again, was largely education. So I suppose in many ways you could say sort of my sort of professional, real job side in life has largely been tied up with education in the jewellery industry.
The Society of Jewellery Historians, you set that up as well. What was your thinking behind the society?
Way back in it's actually 1977, it struck me that there was there were these people interested in jewellery, old jewellery or jewellery of all periods, museum curators, conservators, archaeologists, researchers, and all these people, and there was no real communication between them. You know, sort of the average museum curator wouldn't know what a gemologist was, or somebody digging up in the field wouldn't recognize something else. So I was thinking there should be some means of bringing these people together, because, you know, the sum is always worth more than the individual parts, isn't it? So if you could combine all this knowledge, find a sort of forum which people could share their knowledge, it would help the subject to grow. And I discussed this with a guy I knew quite well, who was a guy called John Goodall, who was a kind of fixture at the Society of Antiquaries. He's always in the library there. I have no idea what his income came from, but he was pretty well always in the library there, working away on old medieval seals and this sort of thing. And I used to come in and sit in my gallery I had then, drinking coffee with me, and we're discussing jewellery. I said, John, what do you think? We need something to bring these people together. And he said, that's a good idea. We could set up a little society. I said, well, I was just thinking of sort of publishing a newsletter and sending it round. He said, no, I'll have a word with the Antiquaries, Society of Antiquaries, and see if they're prepared, you know, to use that place, if they would sort of host it in a way. So we got, you know, this matured, and we talked to various other people involved in the jewellery world, British Museum, Victoria Albert Museum, and places. And we got together a small committee, and that November, I think it was, we had an inaugural meeting. So it was very exciting. And as I say, we've arranged conferences over the years. We publish a now online journal. We have a magazine now 3 times a year, and lectures. The lectures have been held at the Society of Antiquaries in London, which is a wonderful building to have these things in. With COVID, it's not possible, but there's a silver lining to that cloud, because it's actually prompted the society to sort of modernize itself a little bit, the Society of Jewellery Historians. And these we're now doing Zoom lectures. We're putting them out on online, and they're going online on the members' website. So if you can't get to one of our lectures, which in real days are held at the Society of Antiquaries about 6 o'clock in the evening. You can't get to one of those. They are from now on going to be recorded anyway, so they will always be available for members on our website. So it's a great society. It's worth joining. I think anyone interested in jewellery history should be a member. And we always have at least one lecture a year devoted to sort of contemporary jewellery, contemporary designers. I had Jonathan Boyd talking a couple of months ago from Royal College. I mean, a fantastic lecture on his sort of, I don't like the word inspiration. It annoys me a bit like the word heritage, but talking about what drove him and his ideas behind his jewellery. So yes, it's an interesting thing to start, and it seems to be ticking over all right. It's a fun thing, and I recommend people to join it.
What do you think are sort of the challenges and gaps in knowledge at the moment that you feel all these societies should really look at addressing?
I think the most useful thing they can do is educate. I'm sorry, I keep harking on about education, but sending out glossy magazines. And I think one of the problems now is that a lot of jewellery magazines are really just sort of let's say sort of press releases from jewellery companies, topped and tailed by the magazine. There's not a lot of kind of meat in them. They're not. If you look at jewellery, jewellery trade magazines going back, even back to the sort of 100 years, they're solid stuff. They're educating the whole time. How do you tell this? What's new on the market? How to find out what it is? Now they tend to be a little bit more sort of marketing magazines for jewellery designers and things. So I think that what they could do more is concentrate on sort of education, without being too sort of patronizing about it, but to actually tell people what they need to know. Articles about what they can do and what they can't do and how they should do it, and things that's going to help people grow their businesses in practical ways, and knowledge. So I think that's probably the big thing, is more education. But these days there's so many ways of doing that. It doesn't have to be sort of instructing, sort of somebody wagging their finger at you telling you what to do. It can be done in subtle ways, but to teach people how to improve their business experience, and of course the experience of the jewellery buying public. With regards to the Society of Jewellery Historians, or the topic of jewellery history in its entirety, the big thing that constantly surprises me is how little research that's been done on more recent jewellery. It's extraordinary. I mean, there's endless books, articles, and so on medieval Roman jewellery. I mean, in my bookshelves, if I want to find out what sort of typical Roman solder alloys are for gold jewellery, there's probably, I don't know, a dozen or more articles or books. It'll give me good ideas of analyses of Roman solders. But you say to somebody who's dealing in more recent sort of vintage or antique jewellery, say, what solder alloys was Castellani using? Or what about Lalique? What are the compositions of enamels? They don't know. this has been left out, and there's just as many fake bits of 19th century jewellery kicking around as there are fakes of Roman jewellery, probably more so. But people aren't really looking at these things. There's no research, to my knowledge. There's only one article I know that gives a sort of analysis of the gold that Lalique was using. I don't understand this. So I think the gap really is for people to study the technology of 18th, 19th century jewellery, in early 20th century jewellery in some detail.
And perhaps at the same time, we could also look at documenting what's going on today for those who are going to be writing about us in the future. That I also don't think happens sufficiently enough, but it's maybe a barrier for people with an interest, that writing component. And perhaps what you say is interesting. It doesn't have to be the traditional formats anymore. It could be different formats as well.
It's a difficult problem, that one. I mean, this is something that worries me, because I mean, I'm in my research, I'm looking at sort of a lot of books, obviously. I mean, behind me, and love spending time in libraries. Libraries are my cathedral. So I love sitting in them, just working on stuff. Now everything is digital. I mean, I have a huge digital library of articles and things published. I mean, tens of thousands of articles relating, all reasonably well sort of put in separate folders, so I know what to look for where. But how are they going to survive? I mean, I can look at a book in a library that's 300 years old and read it. Are my PDFs going to be readable by anybody, or is anybody's PDFs going to be readable in 300 years? A lot of the photographs I got on my desk, I got photographs that my great-grandfather took at archaeological sites, black and white photographs, as clear and crisp as the day I took them. I've got box loads of colour slides, the old sort of 2-inch square, whatever they were, colour slides taken in the 70s, 80s, where the colours have all run and they're unusable. So the advance of technology doesn't always mean to the advance of longevity. And I think that's the big problem, is how do we keep this stuff alive? I mean, this podcast, I mean, I'm not sure it'll ever be any use to anybody in the future, but I mean, will it be around in any form, 300 years from now? But if it was written in a magazine, then it probably would be, hard copy magazine. So I think that's my big worry. Is technology is fantastic. I love it. I'm an early adopter. I was using computer by the end of the 70s. But it has its downfalls, and one of which is the longevity of the things it's recording. I mean, for example, you can say, well, print everything out. But I mean, does everyone know whether laser print, I can't remember what it is, I mean, it's a carbon-based thing, isn't it? Is that going to survive hundreds of years? Like old print, I can read a book printed by Caxton 500 years ago, but will I be able to read a laser printed article 100 years from now? I don't know. I suppose people are testing this stuff, but it's a major worry.
And the sheer amount of resources out there make it very challenging to retrieve things sometimes, and we just keep adding. What warrants itself to become physical? Does that stimulate longevity? Because that's a really important thing to consider when you're then deciding on the channel to use.
One of the things you're talking about, you said the sort of the wealth of information out there, that's both good and it's both bad. Two reasons it's bad. One of which, an awful lot of people today think research is Googling. Now, you Google something, you find it in Wikipedia and Google and everything else, and that's research. I've seen things, people, write articles, even sort of research papers, and basically they're just taking what they find online. Now, obviously, it's a huge resource. I mean, when I was working on the Black Prince's ruby, of all the medieval texts and documents, 80% of those were available online. Some kind librarian somewhere had scanned this stuff, put it online. I don't know if there's anybody else in the world interested in it, but it's amazing what you can find online. But there's just so much. And a lot of stuff is repeated over and over again with no substantiation. I mean, for example, going back to my recent thing on the Black Prince's ruby, and whatever you go, I mean, it's millions of pages will mention this on the internet, all saying this belonged to the Black Prince. They never question it. It just goes on and on and on. And making, repetition doesn't make it true. The more cautious writers have said a believed to be, or the legend says, a little bit more cautious. But no, half or 90% of the internet now, it's a fact. So there's a lot of misleading. People don't check their sources. They take things, they see it on the internet, then repeat it. And I said most frustrating for the researcher in jewellery and probably many other things is Pinterest. I mean, you'll find you're sort of researching a type of Roman ring, and you suddenly find a wonderful photograph of one very much like it on the internet. Pinterest doesn't say where it's from. Why would anybody post something on a site without saying which museum it was in or which book it had come out? I mean, it's crazy, but it's very, very frustrating. I mean, thank heavens, the things like academia online, academia.org, which is a huge resource of articles, JSTOR, which you have to pay a subscription for, but for researchers, it's well worth it to look at articles published. I mean, there's no one journal, there's no one-stop source, unfortunately, these days. It's totally diverse. So the benefit of all this is there's a huge amount of stuff being published, particularly new work on jewellery coming out of Far East China. There's some amazing scholars over there working on mainly Chinese jewellery, but not entirely Chinese jewellery. Eastern Europe, or what was formerly Eastern Europe, some wonderful work being done on jewellery. But they tend to be published in local journals or more general archaeological journals. So the secret today is trying to collate this stuff, keep track of it, rather than subscribe. You can't subscribe to everything; it's impossible. So I see academia and JSTOR are really the things that they are the sources for today.
The coronavirus pandemic has disrupted our world significantly. And perhaps as an expert on the past and a key industry supporter, I wanted to ask for your thoughts on the future of our field.
I mean, the virus has had a huge impact on everyone's lives, and there's no way of belittling that. I mean, it's put a lot of smaller people out of business. It's changed relationships. It's affected families and everything else, and killed people. So it's had an extraordinary effect on our life. But there are one sort of positive effect. I mean, some people might say it's a negative, but one sort of I see as a positive side effect of this is that it's kickstarted a lot of technical stuff, that it's changed the way just the Society of Jewellery Historians, and from now on, everything will be broadcast online as well as done in a sort of a room in front of an audience. So this has changed. I think that's very much for the good. The fact that people are able to work from home, I think, is good. It's helped online sales enormously. I think a lot of people who thought they used to have to have a shop with a front door and a sort of worry about being able to take a lunch break can now work from an office equally well. And they realize this. The idea that people would buy a diamond ring on the internet was laughed at just 10, 20 years ago. Nowadays, you have diamonds selling for millions. I mean, a lot of Sotheby's and Christie's auctions are online now for things fetching a huge sum of money. And that's made possible not just because you've got a selling mechanism available online and good cameras and graphics to allow it to happen, but you've also got ways of representing and photographing the things. You can show, describe jewellery very well online. There are ways of doing it now that weren't possible. You have scans, 3D scans, or these wonderful things where you photograph from every angle, so you can create a kind of three-dimensional moving thing of an actual piece of jewellery. It's done with gemstones all the time, and more and more with jewellery. I mean, these things have existed before the virus, of course, but this has kickstarted. It's given them a sort of boot up the rear, if you like, to progress faster. So this is going to have a huge effect. Jewellery design has changed a lot. I mean, as you say, we talked about Rhino, and I mean, never forget you have a choice. There are other software programs. So things like that have allowed designers to change the way they're doing things. And nowadays, a jewellery designer can, you don't necessarily need a sort of studio with a workbench and lots of breakable saw blades and getting your hands dirty. You can sit in front of a computer screen, email the STL file to a manufacturer, and FedEx will send you back the finished piece sort of 3 days later or 2 weeks later, whatever it is. So it's changed the whole jewellery supply chain, and this has been sped up by the virus. So the virus has had a positive, as well as horrible negative effects on many people. It's also had a positive thing. It's sort of done what I think would have happened naturally, but probably over a much longer time period. I mean, it's quite fun looking back at jewellery designs through the sort of the 90s, 1990s, into the early sort of part of 21st century, is you can see jewellery designs change at a certain point. It's almost as if on blew a whistle. And that's the introduction of NURBS, which is the Rhino approach, where you can get different curves and different ways things move, sort of interaction of curves, which wasn't possible before. Car design changes the same way, the different shapes and the curves of cars. And it changed with the technology. So it's sort of, to some extent, jewellery design is impacted on by computer technology. And this has happened in its form right through history. I mean, the introduction of iron tools changed the jewellery industry in the Iron Age. So, I mean, technology in other fields has always impacted on jewelry manufacture, but computer technology most certainly has. One thing that worries me is with computer-aided design for jewelry is that I think you do need still to have had bench training first, at least to some extent, because you see pieces being designed on the computer. They look absolutely beautiful on the computer. It's like architectural drawings. You see this amazing architectural model or drawing. You think, isn't that a wonderful building? When you see the concrete lump in place when it's built, you think it looks really ugly. And the same with jewelry. It's not just the aesthetics of the thing. It's that you have to understand, that the prongs or claws to hold a stone have to be of a certain thickness. There's no point designing something. You can design and render a piece of jewelry. It looks absolutely gorgeous on the screen, but in practice, how are you ever going to polish the inside curves of that piece? So I think you need a sort of practical knowledge as well as computer knowledge to be a jewelry designer. And I think that's very important. So I don't think you're ever going to move totally away from the workbench. I think understanding how things are made, how things are finished in particular, it's important. And the other thing that I think is probably not taught enough in jewelry schools is a little bit of the metallurgy of the materials. Why gold and why silver behave the way they do, why they crack the way they do, things like that. I think that's important. And I don't think that's covered enough. That's something else. You've got the history, but also the materials, why they behave the way they do. I think that's important.
In the British Academy of Jewelry, we agree entirely with you. We teach the students jewelry bench skills before they are taught any rhino, because we've seen these problems happen, and we teach metallurgy because having that knowledge of why the material behaves in the way it behaves, then you can problem solve much better.
No, so one of the things remember that spurred me to the Society of Jewellery Historians, I was reading a catalogue of an exhibition of jewellery that was held in a museum in America. And there was a pair of hoops, gold hoops, complete little gold rings. I mean, no gaps in them at all. And the curator catalogued them as earrings. And obviously the fact they hadn't got any kind of way of putting them on the ear because they were complete rings obviously puzzled him briefly. So the curator then said they must have been soldered together after they'd been placed on the ear. And that just showed me how completely technically out of touch an archaeologist could be. I mean, the idea of soldering gold while it was on somebody's ear, I don't think you'd do that today.
Yeah, very interesting that, isn't it? You are, of course, also a visiting professor teaching history to jewelry students. And as we've just been talking about, looking back at technologies that in the past have changed and impacted jewelry designs, and as they are still doing so today, how important do you think it is for students to familiarize themselves with the past of our profession?
I think it's important to know a bit about the history. I think there are two reasons for it. One of which is that you get a feeling for the material. You sometimes see a sort of a modern contemporary design by some jeweler, and you look at this and find one identical that was made in the Bronze Age. It looks identical, the thing. So it's quite nice to know what's gone before and you can get inspired, to use that word I don't like again, by early pieces, but also to understand how technology has developed. I mean, jewelry isn't just a kind of an island we are now. It has this whole 5,000 years of development, and understanding something of that foundation adds another dimension to your understanding. It also needs another dimension to selling the pieces. I mean, it sounds a bit sort of money grabbing, but in a sense, by being able to market, by understanding a bit about the history, it does help market pieces. This idea of what it comes from and why, and there's the whole heritage, if you like, of a piece of jewelry, the ideas behind it. It adds this whole sort of different momentum to jewelry when you come to sell it. So I think it's important to understand the past. And then, someone said, you can't predict the future until you understand the past. And to some extent, that's probably true with jewelry as well. You get an idea of what's coming by looking at what's been, I think.
As our look towards the future has been colored with uncertainty, it is encouraging to remember humans' affinity with the dormant and that it dates back centuries. When we look at the past, it is unlikely that this will ever end. Change, however, is an inevitable part of life. We only have to look through some of Dr. Ogden's books to trace changes in fashion, tastes, and most importantly, technologies, which played a big role in these developments unfolding. For sharing his fascinating life story and thoughts today, I would like to thank you wholeheartedly, Dr. Ogden. You have and continue to make a meaningful contribution to the field in a variety of manners, and we are very grateful for your efforts. Thanks so much for joining me for this inspiring conversation.
Oh, great pleasure.
Next month, I'll be joined by another guest, so watch this space to find out who it is. But for now, this was Sophie Boons for the BAJ podcast series, Jewellery History, with Dr. Jack Ogden. Thank you for listening and have a wonderful day.